instead of asking about inequality, we should say, if it is true that technology multiplies human productivity, increases pay, how do we help everyone use more technology? And then all of a sudden it's a discussion about how do we get more technology in our lives, not how do we erect walls to keep the technology out. The place that I think is best to start in a discussion about artificial intelligence is the definition of what it is, because interestingly, there is not a consensus definition. There's not a consensus definition because there's not a consensus definition of what intelligence is. And there's also not agreement on what we mean by the word artificial exactly. Is it artificial like artificial turf? Isn't really turf, it's just pretending to be. So is artificial intelligence actually real intelligence or not? There's not even agreement on that. The simplest sort of definition you would ever use for it is that it's things that react to their environment. It's a very low level of definition, but it would qualify for your sprinkler that comes on when the grass is dry, or the cat food dish that refills itself would be an AI, and it is a primitive one. The way it's most commonly used in this day and age, again, with the caveat there is no agreement on it, is systems that learn from their environment. So as they are used, they become more intelligent. There's a lot of fear wrapped up in artificial intelligence. And so it's pretty important to keep in mind there are two completely different things people mean with it. So there's artificial general intelligence, which is an AI as smart and versatile as a human, like MacGyver or something like that, where it can do kind of anything. And then there's artificial intelligence that can kind of do one thing. And there's a temptation to see that as an evolutionary path, that it can do one thing, then two things, and three things, and 9 things, and 100 things, and it's fully, but that isn't, there's by no means consensus on that, and most people, I think, would not see it that way, that a general intelligence is actually something completely different than what we're building now. So we may have a breakthrough and build one, but it isn't that we get ever closer and we eventually have it. So putting the artificial general intelligence aside and just talking about the kind of AI we have today, the one that routes your car and does all of that, there's still a lot of fear wrapped up in it. There's 3 possible narratives of the future that people often go through. The first one is that there'll be a class of workers who are not going to be able to compete with the machines. They will find themselves unemployed and they won't have any way to earn a living. And that we'll enter something like a permanent depression, economic depression. You'll have the haves and the have-nots are locked out, and that's just how it's going to be from now on. That's a narrative. And a lot of people worry about that. And then there's a second narrative that goes, oh, no. It's far, far worse than that. The computer's going to be able to do everything a person could do. Not most people, everyone, every single person. That there'll be this moment where the computer can learn something faster than a human. And at that point, it's game over. Every new thing will be a computer job. But then there's a third narrative, and it's the one I believe, that we're not going to have disruption. In the West, over the past 250 years, we've had, since the Industrial Revolution, unemployment's been between 5 and 10% the whole time. It was a worldwide depression, of course, where it was higher, but that wasn't from technology. But in that time period, it was 5 to 10%, 5 to 10%, 5 to 10%, always year after year after year after year. And there were 3 things that came along in that time period that one could argue have a bigger impact than the kind of AI we're talking about today. And I know that isn't a particularly, everybody wants to think that like, no, this is different, today's different, this one's different. But there are 3 other things that have happened of similar magnitude. The first was the replacement of animal power with machines. And so you just think about that. Every animal that was a draft animal, all of that was replaced with steam, with machines. And this happened over the course of 20 years. Steam went from being almost no power generation to virtually all power was generated by steam. So you just have to understand that was this incredible shift. And what happened to unemployment? No, it was 5 and 10%, between 5 and 10%, 5 and 10%. So the second one would be the assembly line. The assembly line is artificial intelligence in a way, if you think about it. If you were a craftsman and you were building cars in your garage one at a time, and then this new piece of technology came along, this assembly line, that would be a very frightening thing. And that everybody would be like, I'm going to lose my job, and how am I going to compete with this? And all of the same narrative, it's the same story. Guess what happened to unemployment? 5 to 10%, 5 to 10%. And then the third thing that happened was electrification of industry. And that happened so quickly because it was a competitive advantage. It was a competitive advantage for a company to be able to, electrify. And then you didn't have noisy steam engines. You had electricity and you had lights and all of that. And that had the potential to disrupt everything. And what happened to unemployment? 5 to 10%, 5 to 10%, year after year. And so what's going on? What's happening is that in all of these cases, people use technology to grow their productivity higher. They use the technology to grow their productivity. And that's really the way we get wage growth. The reason, I don't work as hard as my great-great-grandparents, but I live a much more comfortable life, it's because every hour of my time is far more productive because of technology. So what happens is these technologies come along and we figure out how to use them to grow productivity and to grow our wages. And we just build new jobs around them. The Oxford study frightened a lot of people, You just Google 47% job loss, and you're going to see that number over and over again. And I think people were deliberately playing on fear with that because they didn't say 47% of jobs are going to be lost. They go out of their way to say, we are not saying 47% of the jobs are being lost. We are not saying that. But the headlines were 47% of jobs are going to be lost. What they said was 47% of the things people do in their jobs can be automated. And that's a completely different thing. And by the way, that's not even particularly big news. My father sold insurance for 25, 30 years. And I'm sure along the way, 47% of the stuff he did in his job was automated. And that's what's going on. The OECD, on the other hand, said, we want to figure out actually what jobs are going to be eliminated. Not the skill-based approach, but a whole different way. And they said, over the similar time period, we're going to lose 9% of jobs. And then you say, well, 9% of jobs in 20 years, that still sounds like a lot. But if you think about it, that's pretty much the normal churn of the economy. If you look at 1950 to 2000, you probably lost 30%. Switchboard operators went away and typewriter repairmen lost their jobs and all of that. That is probably a normal rate that technology just creates and destroys new industries. And it does it reasonably gradually. It isn't quite as dramatic as people say. There's another narrative people offer that I also think is potentially disingenuous. And it goes like this. It says, yes, I understand technology is creating new jobs and destroying jobs. I understand that. But what it's doing is it's creating new jobs at the high end, like a geneticist, and it's destroying jobs at the low end, like a taxi driver. And then here's the part that I think is the logical fallacy. They say, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think those taxi drivers are going to become geneticists? And then they pose that question. And that actually isn't the question at all. That isn't how it ever works. What happens is a college biology professor becomes a geneticist. A junior college professor gets the full professorship. A high school biology teacher gets the junior college job. A substitute teacher gets hired at the high school, and the person who lost their job gets the job as a substitute teacher. The question is not, can a taxi driver become a geneticist? The question is, can everybody do a job just a little harder than the one they're doing now? And then everybody gets a promotion. Everybody, you notice in that thing, goes up one level. And so we want AI and technology to create jobs at the high end, because it's a chance for everybody to move up a level. And that's the story of progress in the world. It's true, technology does change the workforce, and it can change it somewhat rapidly. But I think people even overestimate that. There's kind of this narrative that the self-driving car is going to put all the truckers out of work, and then all the truckers are going to put all the diners out of work, and that it's just going to cascade, and that's going to be this giant tipping point. I don't think that that is a likely scenario. I mean, so you first have to say, it's going to take a while to iron the technology out. That's true, everybody knows that. Then it's going to take time to iron out the legislative part. Then people are going to have to get used to it and be fine that there's no trucker in there. Then all the legal stuff has to be sorted out. And then the machinery has to be retrofit. And all along the line, people are like, I wonder if I should become a truck driver. And they're like, maybe not. And all along the line, truck drivers are retiring because, oh, well, probably a good time to retire. And that even when these new technologies come out, even when you can see a straight line to them eliminating a field, it still takes a long time, and that there's plenty of time for the economy to absorb the change. You know, I think about the person that mows my yard. I've known him for years, doesn't have much education, and he supports himself by mowing. And then I think there's going to be a self-driving lawnmower, right, that's just going to go around my yard and is going to mow it. And then people ask the question, well, what is he going to do? I happen to live in an old home. I live in a Victorian-era home. And I thought to myself, well, that's easy. I'll just give him one book about what were gardens like in the Victorian era. And then all of a sudden, he can go door to door and say, I can help you have a garden that's what it would have been when the house was new. And that's something he can learn. That's not but there's not going to be a robot made to do that. So say he does that for 30 years. And then Victorian Robot Co. comes out with some robot that goes around and plants Victorian gardens for people. Then he reads one book on how to grow grape arbors. And he goes door to door and says, how would you like grapes grown in your backyard? I can come here, I'll cultivate them, I'll help you harvest them, and you'll get fresh grapes in your yard. There's no grape cultivating robot out there. It's like every one of these things is an opportunity just for people to do more and to grow their own productivity. And none of that is, oh, he has to become a geneticist or he's out of work. A lot of people are talking about a universal basic income. It's, of course, an old idea. In the United States, it was, I think, first proposed by Thomas Paine, who suggested, 250 years ago that that would be something that we should do. I'm not sure. First of all, I don't believe there's any limit to work. I don't think you're going to need to. I think that it's far better to guarantee people a job than guaranteeing them an income. You walk down the street and every kindergarten class that has more than 20 students should have 15. And every piece of infrastructure that's falling apart, every library that needs to have more books. I mean, there is so much work to do in the world. And to think for an instant that, oh no, we're just about to build machines, they're going to do all work. We're going to get up and look around the city and now there's nothing to do. Everything's done. It's not going to happen. What we're going to have is an opportunity to actually do a lot of the things we've always wanted to do. And so there's not going to be a shortage of jobs. There's, of course, a discussion going on about income inequality. And I think the thing to realize is we should really think hard about what it is specifically that we're concerned about. What technology does do is it makes it easier to make $1 billion. I mean, not for me, but it makes it easier for people to make $1 billion. That's how come, in 1900 there was 1 in the whole world, and Google made 7 and Facebook made 5. And so, because technology has the ability to touch so many lives, it has the ability to create an enormous amount of wealth. So the question is, are we concerned about inequality, or are we concerned about the standard of living of the poor? And I have a feeling that if you went to the poor and said, we're going to double your real income, but we're going to triple the billionaires, they would take it. They would take it. We would all take a higher standard of living if we're offered one, especially those impoverished. And it may be a mistake to worry too much about what the other guy has and just focus on how can we make sure that the poor have opportunity to better their situation. And maybe steer the conversation away from inequality more towards making sure that everyone has equity. Instead of asking about inequality, we should say, if it is true that technology multiplies human productivity, increases pay, how do we help everyone use more technology? And then all of a sudden it's a discussion about how do we get more technology in our lives, not how do we erect walls to keep the technology out. The jobs that machines can do will always be the lowest paying ones. And so the sooner we can get rid of those, the better. Any job that you can imagine a machine doing, forget for a minute whether we have a machine that does it, but just think of any job that a machine could do. If you make a human do that job, that is literally humanizing. Because you've just said a machine could do it. There's nothing whatsoever about that job that requires a human. And so those are the jobs we want to get people out of the business of doing, because they're soul-sapping jobs and they have no real purpose. You sit there doing the job knowing a machine could just as easily do it. We just haven't built a machine that can wash windows or that can do this or do that. But someday we'll build it. And the idea that we use people for stand-ins for machines and that we're afraid of that going away is kind of what baffles me. It's like good riddance to all of that. It isn't that people who think there's only so many jobs and that, oh no, those are the only jobs, and if those go away, there won't be any more. They miss the point entirely of how you make a job. A job isn't something that just kind of materializes out of thin air. A job is created the instant you pick up something and you add either labor or technology to it, and you make something worth more. And that difference between what it was worth when you picked it up and what it was worth when you're done, that's called a wage. And you just made a job. And so that anytime you can take a piece of technology and make yourself more productive with it, you just made a job. That's what it is. And so I would encourage people just to look around the world, look around their life, look everywhere around them and say, what can I pick up? What can I do something to? And what can I make worth more? The people that are afraid, they have a sense that, yes, like everybody agrees, technology has on net been good. That on net, yes, it has been disruptive, but it has, on net, produced a higher standard of living. But they all follow it up, the people that are concerned, by saying, but this time is different. And that's really what you have to press on. Why is this time different? It can only be different either because AI is a more disruptive technology, which I think is a hard case to make, given that, we used to not have factories and electricity and all of these very fundamental things, and then we got them. Or you say it's going to happen quicker than prior technologies, it's going to be disruptive. But again, I think that's a hard case to make too. Maybe it's a little bit of an insult to our ego to think that, yeah, there's nothing special about this time. The technology changes, but the end effect is people will take that technology and they're going to make new jobs out of it. And they're going to be better jobs because they're not going to be dehumanizing jobs machines can do. They're going to be jobs only people can do. And that's what you want to have people do. It's hard from our vantage point in a way. If somebody had told you in 1995, hey, we're going to take all the computers in the world and we're going to connect them together with common protocols like hypertext. And we're going to build web browsers and we're going to make hyperlinks so that you can click on them and go to other ones. And they'd be like, oh, that sounds interesting. And then they say, oh, no, you don't understand. It's going to create trillions and trillions of dollars in wealth. It's going to create Google. It's going to create eBay. It's going to create Etsy. It's going to create all of these thousands of things that we now do. You would have been like, I don't see it. I just don't see that wiring a bunch of computers together builds trillions of dollars in new wealth and creates all these new jobs. And that's what happens. And if you think just wiring a bunch of computers together did that, imagine when we build some form of artificial intelligence and just what we're going to be able to do with it and how it's going to empower us. This is not a time to be afraid. It's a time to be excited about all the things we're going to do with this technology. A similar thing happened with the cotton gin. You had a new technology that came along, and the cotton gin famously did the work of 20 men. One man could do the work of 20, which is a fancy way you would think of saying cotton gin puts 19 people out of work, each one of them. And I'm sure that the person who operates the cotton gin, they do better than they did before, but the other 19 don't. That would be what you would think. But what happened in reality is that the cotton gin lowered the cost of cotton tremendously. And what that did is caused the textile industry to take off. And so net employment in the textile industry shot through the roof. So what we saw was that you introduced a new technology and it actually ends up creating more downstream jobs. When the automatic teller machine came out, they said, it's called an automatic teller machine. It's like clearly this is a robot teller. And they said there are going to be less tellers. And the reality of it is there are more tellers today than there were when the ATM came out, because what happened is that lowered the cost of opening new bank branches, because you could just have an ATM and one human teller. And so banks opened a bunch more branches because they were less expensive and they needed to hire more tellers. We have translators. Google Translate is already doing a job as good, they say, as a human translator. And so you would think, well, that's the end of translators, but it isn't. It's a field that is predicted to have growth. Why? Because all of a sudden the translators are rethinking their job. More business is going on internationally. I'm going to work with my clients on the customs of that country and on drafting more specific contracts and so forth. When tax software came out, it didn't put accountants out of work. Accountants expanded what they do for a living, and there are more accountants than ever, and we have tax software. They became estate planners. And it's time and time again, the technology lowers the cost, and the people in the industry expand what they do. And so I think the thing to do is, if you have a job and technology is being introduced to it, don't say, I need to keep that from happening, or I need to leave. What I would encourage people to do is say, how can I expand my job? How can I do the human part of my job more and let the machine do the part of my job, which is probably not the most fun at all. If you're a teller, I'm sure the least interesting thing for you to do is to give somebody $200 when they hand you their card. So you get a machine to do that, and then the teller actually helps you with a college loan or figures out all the things that a human can do. And so think long and hard about how your job can be expanded to become more human, and use technology to enable that.